Every Friday at dawn, a truck dumped a mountain of bruised apples onto her field, and Lena Marchetti waved them in like gold. The whole county called her crazy. Diner Talk said she'd bring every wasp and bear. Her cousin asked if she'd lost her mind. Lena said nothing. She kept piling the fruit higher, working alone while the smell of rot drifted down the road. What nobody knew was that Lena had discovered how to turn that rot into liquid gold. Lena Marchetti was a quiet woman who traded a comfortable marketing job for 11 acres of weeds and a barn full of doubt. She had no farming background, no business plan, and no money. What she did have was a conviction that the very rot everyone mocked could become something rare and valuable. By the time the first five-figure check arrived, the entire town wanted to know how she did it. The answer began 18 months earlier, with a single decision that everyone called a mistake. 18 months before the first truckload of rotting apples arrived, Lena Marchetti lived in a one-bedroom apartment outside Rochester, writing marketing copy for products she didn't believe in. She was good at her job and hated it in equal measure. The only thing that felt real was a memory from childhood, her grandmother almost standing over a bushel of scarred, ugly apples, humming while she peeled them. Then the lawyer called. Alma had died and left Lena her entire estate, 11 acres of overgrown farmland, a farmhouse with a leaning porch, a barn full of rusted equipment, and an apple orchard that hadn't been pruned in more than 10 years. Lena drove out for the funeral and stayed 3 extra days. She walked the property, pushed through waist-high grass to touch the gnarled trunks of trees her grandmother had planted decades earlier, and felt something her cubicle had never given her, a tug she couldn't explain. She handed in her notice the following Monday, packed 4 boxes of clothes, and moved into the farmhouse with no plan beyond fixing the porch before winter. 3 miles down the county road sprawled Haverson Orchards, one of the largest commercial apple operations in the Northeast. They moved tens of thousands of tons of fruit each harvest, but not every apple made the cut. Bruised drops, hail-stung fruit, apples that went soft before picking. Those rejects cost the orchard real money to haul to a composting facility 2 counties away. When the operations manager, Grant Ashby, heard through a mutual acquaintance that the Marchetti place had a young owner desperate for any kind of income, he made her an offer that sounded almost like a joke. Free apples. All she had to do was let his trucks dump the rejects on her land instead of paying tipping fees elsewhere. Lena said yes before he'd finished the sentence. Grant stared at her, waiting for a catch that never came. He'd expected a negotiation, maybe a refusal, not enthusiasm. He left wondering if he'd just taken advantage of a woman in over her head. Word gets around in a town where everyone still waves at passing cars. Within a week, half of Millbrook had an opinion. At the diner, they said she was attracting every wasp and bear in the township. Her own cousin called to ask if she'd lost her mind, taking on someone else's garbage with no plan and no money. A former classmate posted a photo of the growing pile online with a caption that got more laughing emojis than she probably intended. Lena said nothing. She just kept piling the fruit higher, working alone through rain and frost, while the smell of fermenting rot drifted down the county road. But she wasn't working blind. She had spent a year in secret, late at night in her apartment, studying old preservation manuals and fermentation chemistry, and she remembered exactly what her grandmother used to tell her. Alma had a habit of buying the ugly fruit at the farmer's market, the apples too scarred or lopsided to sell at full price, and turning them into applesauce and pies that were legendary in the county. When young Lena asked why she didn't buy the pretty ones like everyone else, Alma never hesitated. "Fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less," she'd say, wiping her hands on her apron. "People decided that. Nature never did." It was a small thing to say, a sentence a grandmother tosses off while peeling apples on a Tuesday evening, but it had lodged in Lena's mind and stayed there for over a decade, waiting. Standing in that cold barn, staring at a mountain of bruised fruit the world had thrown away, Lena finally understood it. The rot everyone wanted to avoid was exactly what she needed. Overripe apples carry more natural sugar, and sugar is fuel for fermentation. She had no business plan, no mentor, and no guarantee that what she was about to attempt would work. She only had a half-remembered sentence and 11 acres of empty grass. That winter, she crushed her first few hundred pounds of apples in an old cider press, hauled the pulp into food-grade buckets, covered them with cloth, and waited. What she got was not vinegar. It was a thick gray film of mold and a stench so sharp it drove her out of the barn for 2 days. The whole town was watching, and the first attempt had failed in the most humiliating way possible. But Lena, standing in the dark with a flashlight in her teeth, scribbled a single word in a notebook. Again. What Lena hadn't told anyone was that the moldy failure hadn't surprised her. She'd expected to fail. She'd budgeted for it. While the town was laughing, she was quietly working through a list of variables she'd already identified as failure points: sanitation, sugar content, oxygen exposure, wild yeast stability, temperature control. The first failed batch had simply checked off box number 1. Now she moved to the second. She spent 2 days scrubbing every surface in the barn with a diluted bleach solution, then rinsing until the place smelled like nothing at all. She purchased food-grade buckets with airtight seals, not the old pickle barrels she'd scavenged the first time, and she began logging every step in a spiral-bound notebook she kept locked in the farmhouse kitchen. The orchard kept sending more apples, and Grant kept shaking his head. Piles rose higher. The smell sweetened and soured in waves. Her neighbors started driving past slower, not to laugh anymore, but because something about the operation was starting to look less like a hoarding situation and more like a process. Batch 2 started cleaner. She crushed a few hundred pounds of fruit, strained the pulp into a half-dozen buckets, and this time she let them sit loosely covered with a double layer of cheesecloth. She'd learned from a fermentation manual that wild yeast lives on the skins of apples, and that if you create an oxygen-poor environment, those yeast cells will convert sugar to alcohol. It was simple biochemistry, but what she hadn't learned yet was that fermentation is alive, and alive means unpredictable. The juice bubbled and turned cloudy. It smelled sharp and promising. Then it stalled. For 3 weeks it sat there, half-fermented alcohol refusing to take the next step into vinegar, and she couldn't figure out why. She tried warming the barn with a propane heater. She tried adding a splash of raw cider from a local mill to introduce fresh yeast. Nothing. Finally, in desperation, she posted a question to an online home brewing forum at 2 in the morning and received a reply from a retired winemaker named Frank Delano, who lived 2 hours away and had spent 30 years making vinegar for high-end restaurants. His message was 3 sentences long. You're suffocating your acetobacter. They need oxygen to turn alcohol into acetic acid. Loosen the lids and stop treating them like they're going to die if they breathe. She loosened the lids. Within 4 days, the alcohol began to sour into something recognizably vinegary. Frank became an accidental mentor. He walked her through the basics over a series of phone calls that Lena took in the barn with the flashlight wedged between her shoulder and her ear. He taught her about the mother, a gelatinous raft of cellulose and acetic acid bacteria that forms naturally on the surface of fermenting vinegar and can be transferred from batch to speed the process. He taught her to test pH with strips instead of guessing, to track which apple varieties produced which flavor profiles, and to filter the finished vinegar through layers of cheesecloth until it ran clear instead of cloudy. He warned her that inconsistent raw material would produce inconsistent product, and that if she wanted repeat customers, she'd need to stop accepting random truckloads and start asking for specific fruit. She wrote every word down. The notebook filled from a few pages to half a journal, then to an entire journal, and she started a second one. But knowing what to do and making it work were still different things. Batch 3 turned to vinegar properly for the first time. She bottled a few test jars and tasted it in the kitchen with a spoon. It was thin, sharp in a one-note way, missing the roundness she'd read about. It was technically vinegar, but it wasn't good. She gave a jar to her aunt anyway, the one person who'd never mocked her, and her aunt said it was nice, in the tone people use when they don't want to hurt your feelings. Lena knew she was still guessing, and guessing at scale would only produce a bigger version of mediocre. That's when Frank said something that changed the game. He told her that the overripe drops from older, Tartar apple varieties most commercial orchards had stopped growing decades ago, produced a more complex acidic profile than the sugary modern cultivars planted in the newer rows. Lena immediately called Grant at Haverson and asked if the orchard still had any older trees. Grant paused for a long moment, then said there was a small block of 30-year-old northern spies at the back edge of the property, trees they barely harvested anymore because the fruit was too ugly for retail and too tart for juice. He'd been dumping their drops into the reject piles without separating them. Lena asked him, as calmly as she could manage, to start keeping those apples separate and to send her every single one. The fourth batch, the first made exclusively from those forgotten northern spies, fermented differently from the start. The juice was paler, more aromatic. The vinegar formed a thick, healthy mother within a week. Lena tested the pH obsessively, logging readings 3 times a day. She tasted samples every morning, tracking the shift from raw alcohol to sharp acetic bite to something deeper. On the 32nd day, she lifted a spoonful in the cold October light and tasted what she had been chasing for 10 months. It was bright and clean, with a faint sweetness that rolled across the tongue before the acidity caught up, nothing like the harsh, single-note liquid from batch 3. She sat down on an overturned bucket and didn't move for 10 minutes. In that barn, alone, with the flashlight battery dying and the county road silent outside, she knew she had something real. But knowing it in a barn is one thing. Getting other people to believe it is another. And the first person outside her family who tasted the new batch would end up changing everything. The first outsider to taste batch 4 wasn't a distributor or a critic. He was a chef named Marcus Webb, who ran a small farm-to-table restaurant 25 minutes away and had a reputation for building menus around whatever the county grew. A mutual acquaintance passed him a jar without much preamble, just a note that said, "Taste this." Marcus opened it in his kitchen after service, dipped a spoon, and then stood there staring at the jar for a full 30 seconds. He called Lena before 8 the next morning. When she answered, he didn't introduce himself. He just said, "Tell me you have more." She didn't. She had exactly 3 gallons of finished vinegar from that northern spy batch, and 2 of them were already spoken for by her aunt and Frank. Marcus asked if he could buy the remaining gallon. She named a price that she pulled out of the air, something barely above the cost of the glass jar, and he agreed before she could finish the sentence. He drove out that afternoon and handed her cash in her own driveway, the same driveway where trucks had been dumping rotting fruit to the amusement of every passing car. That 1 gallon went into a vinaigrette that ran as a special at his restaurant for a single weekend and sold out by Saturday night. Diners asked what it was. Marcus told them about the woman and her mountain of rejected apples. Suddenly, people who had driven past the orchard for years without a second thought were calling the restaurant asking where they could buy a bottle. That phone call turned into 2 calls, then 10. A small farm shop in the next town wanted a dozen bottles to test. Then the owner of a specialty grocery store 40 minutes away, the kind that stocked imported balsamic vinegar at $30 a bottle, reached out and offered to carry Millbrook Reserve. Lena had registered the name by then, Millbrook Reserve Vinegar, plain block letters on a simple label, if she could supply them consistently. That word, consistently, landed like a brick. She had been making vinegar in batches of 5 gallons at a time, working alone in an unheated barn with a flashlight and a notebook. Consistency at scale required equipment she didn't own, a production space she hadn't built, and raw materials she couldn't yet guarantee. She sat down with Grant Ashby at Haverson Orchards and laid out the situation. She didn't want random truckloads anymore. She needed the northern spy drops separated, stored carefully, and delivered on a schedule. She needed to know exactly what varieties were coming so she could plan her fermentation logs months in advance. Grant listened, leaning back in his office chair with the kind of expression a man wears when he's recalculating something fundamental. He'd spent 2 years watching this woman accept other people's garbage without complaint, and now she was negotiating like a supply chain manager with a pending offer from a regional buyer. He agreed to the new arrangement, but the terms shifted. Instead of paying him nothing for the rejects, she'd pay a small per-ton fee, less than he'd spend on disposal, but enough to make the orchard's accountants happy. It was no longer a favor. It was a deal. Then the distributor came. A regional food distributor named Jeff Halsey, who supplied natural food stores across 3 states, tasted the vinegar at the grocery store and tracked Lena down through a series of increasingly urgent emails. He wanted to place a standing order, 200 bottles a month, delivered on pallets with barcodes and batch numbers and insurance paperwork. The number alone would push Millbrook Reserve past 6 figures in annual revenue. Lena read the email 3 times, set her phone down, and walked outside into the cold air. 200 bottles a month meant scaling everything. It meant hearing help, converting the old equipment shed into a proper production room, buying stainless steel tanks instead of food-grade buckets, and navigating the labyrinth of commercial food licensing, inspections, and liability coverage. She had never hired anyone. She had never written a business plan. She had a notebook full of pH readings and a grandmother's sentence she'd repeated to herself so often it had become a kind of prayer. She said yes anyway. And that yes triggered a cascade that transformed not only her operation, but the entire dynamic with the town that had once laughed at her. She hired a former orchard hand named Sam, who understood apples better than she ever would, to manage the crushing and pressing. She brought on her cousin, the same one who'd asked if she'd lost her mind, to handle bottling and shipping after he showed up one afternoon, apologized without quite saying the words, and offered to work for whatever she could pay. She filed for a food processing license, passed a county health inspection, and installed a stainless steel triple sink in the shed that made the whole operation feel suddenly legitimate. The piles of rotting apples disappeared from the front field because Sam processed them within days of delivery now, the fruit moving from truck to crusher to tank with the rhythm of an actual production line. The sweet-sour smell still drifted down the county road, but it smelled less like decay and more like industry. The orchard noticed. Grant Ashby, who had once worried he'd taken advantage of a naive woman, began sending her the best of the rejects, fruit that was too ugly for retail but otherwise sound, because her vinegar now reflected on his orchard's reputation. The partnership deepened. Haverson Orchard started mentioning Millbrook Reserve in their own marketing materials, proud of the fact that their waste had become a premium product. And then, without fanfare, they stopped charging her the per-ton fee. Instead, they started paying her a small sum to take the apples, a symbolic reversal that essentially said, "Your process is so valuable to our brand and our bottom line that we will pay for the privilege of being part of it." The orchard that once paid to dump its rejects now paid her to take them. The same neighbors who'd pulled their trucks to the shoulder to stare at the rotting pile now pulled into her driveway as customers. The woman who'd posted the mocking photo online quietly deleted it and followed the Millbrook Reserve social media account. The diner crowd, never ones to admit fault, simply started ordering her vinegar for their own kitchens, never mentioning the jokes of 2 years earlier. Lena treated every single one of them exactly the same, with a sample spoon and a straightforward answer to whatever question they asked. She didn't need apologies. The shelf space said everything that needed saying. By the end of the 3rd year, Millbrook Reserve vinegar sat on shelves in health food stores across 4 states, and the 200-bottle monthly order had become 1,000. But the numbers only tell the surface of what happened. The real story was what Lena understood during that stretch about the nature of value itself, and how close she came to losing it all before the biggest order of her life even arrived. That crisis arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the distributor called to say their largest retail partner had flagged a batch for inconsistent acidity. If the issue couldn't be traced and resolved within 48 hours, the entire order would be pulled from shelves across 4 states. Lena stood in the production shed, phone pressed to her ear, staring at the tanks that held thousands of gallons of fermenting vinegar. The problem wasn't the fermentation. It was the raw fruit. A sudden early frost had concentrated the sugars in the northern spy apples unevenly, and Lena, rushing to meet demand, had skipped a single pH test on the blending step. One missed test. That was all it took to put everything at risk. She worked for 36 hours straight. Sam crushed fresh apple batches while she recalibrated the tanks, blending higher acid reserves with the affected lot, testing pH every hour instead of every day. Her cousin handled the distributor calls, walking them through the correction process with the kind of confidence that only comes from having watched Lena solve worse problems in a cold barn with far less on the line. By the deadline, the batch tested clean. The order stayed on shelves, but something shifted in Lena that week. She realized she was no longer a woman experimenting in a barn. She was running a business that could fail in ways she hadn't anticipated. The next morning, she hired a quality control specialist and began building the systems that would allow Millbrook Reserve to grow without her having to taste every single spoonful herself. That decision unlocked the next stage. With a reliable team in place, Lena finally had time to do what she'd been avoiding for years: stop and think about what she'd actually built. She walked the property one evening, past the equipment shed that now hummed with stainless steel tanks, past the barn where she'd failed 6 times before tasting success, past the field where the first truckload of rotting apples had spilled out like a taunt. The grass had grown over the old dumping ground. You would never know, looking at it now, that a mountain of garbage had once sat there, attracting laughter and wasps in equal measure. She thought about her grandmother Alma, who had never made a single dollar from her philosophy about bruised fruit. Alma had simply lived it, quietly, in a kitchen that smelled of pie filling and vinegar, while the world outside decided what was worth keeping and what wasn't. Lena understood now that her grandmother hadn't been teaching her about apples. She had been teaching her about people, about the ways we assign value to things based on how they look instead of what they contain. Every rejected apple that came through Haverson Orchards was proof that the world had its assessment backward. Every bottle of Millbrook Reserve that left the shed was proof that Alma had been right. The recognition came in ways Lena never expected. A regional food magazine ran a feature calling her vinegar the most interesting small batch ferment east of the Hudson. A culinary institute invited her to lecture on waste stream economics. The county agricultural extension, which once sent concerned letters about her rotting piles, now pointed to her operation as a model of sustainable farming. And Grant Ashby, the man who had offered free apples as a casual favor, admitted over coffee one morning that her success had forced Haverson Orchards to rethink its entire approach to waste. They were exploring partnerships with other small-batch producers now, using her model. She had not only built a business, she had shifted the way an entire local industry thought about value. The numbers kept climbing. By year 5, Millbrook Reserve Vinegar was in more than 80 stores, and revenue had passed $500,000. But the number Lena cared about most was the one nobody saw: the amount of fruit she had kept from landfills. Over the course of those 5 years, she had diverted more than 300 tons of apples from the waste stream. That number, not the revenue, was what she had framed above her desk, written in her grandmother's handwriting copied from an old recipe card. The fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less. One more thing happened that no one in Millbrook could have predicted. The orchard that once paid to dump its rejects began paying Lena a licensing fee to use her name on a line of branded apple products made from their own second-tier fruit. The partnership had come full circle. Haverson Orchards now printed, featuring Millbrook Reserve Heritage apples on their labels, and every sale carried a small royalty back to the woman they had once written off as naive. Lena took that money and put it into a fund for small farmers in the county who wanted to start value-added operations of their own. She became, in a way she never sought, the person who helped other people see what they already had. The story wasn't really about vinegar. It was about a way of looking at things that most people never bother to practice. Every year, in orchards and farms across the country, perfectly good raw material gets thrown away because it doesn't meet a cosmetic standard that has nothing to do with quality. Most people drive past those piles without a second thought, but every once in a while, someone stops. And that single decision, the choice to look closer at something the world has already dismissed, can change everything. Lena proved it in a cold barn with a flashlight and a notebook. But the truth is every single one of us has rotten apples sitting in our lives right now. Opportunities, relationships, ideas that we've written off because they didn't arrive looking the way we expected. The grandmother who taught her that fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less understood something profound. Value doesn't announce itself. It has to be found by someone willing to look past the bruising. Every year, millions of tons of perfectly good material gets thrown away simply because it fails a cosmetic test that has nothing to do with what it actually contains. And that waste isn't just apples. It's potential. It's the business never started, the talent never developed, the second chance never given because someone decided too early that it wasn't worth the trouble. Alma Marchetti spent her life proving that the decision was the mistake, not the fruit. Lena spent 5 years proving her grandmother was right. If this story reminded you that opportunity doesn't always arrive looking like one, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Tell us in the comments about something you once overlooked that turned out to matter. Share this with someone who needs a reminder today that the messiest looking chances are sometimes the best ones. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching.